And thank you, Bonnie and Becky. Take us away.
All right, thank you, Sam, for being here. And of course, my thanks to Becky, my very frequent pal in these webinars, and to all of you for coming in this morning for acting on input. Today's focus is on focus groups. This is a three-part series, and this first installment will look at gathering a community opinion through focus groups. So Becky and I have some thoughts to share about that, including who to invite and some thoughts about how to frame the conversation for best results. This is the first installment of 3. And Becky and I have done variations on this theme, but usually in longer time frames, like sometimes half-day workshops. So for us to smush our material into 1 hour is always challenging for us. So we will pledge to keep this on time and on track. And today we'll hit the highlights of our experience in using focus groups. And for those of you who may be in the audience have been through the planning for results process, you will remember that focus groups play a very important part of the entire process behind planning for results. So that's today, and then next time in August, we'll have more to say about surveys, and we'll really put the acting on input into action in September, when we will have more to say about using this community data and folding it into your strategic plans. We'll have some points about the acting part today and next time, but the real focus on results will come in September. So I'm sure this is familiar to you, those of you in the audience who are meeting standards at least a tier 2 or 3 level. You know that having a strategic plan is part of the standards process, and standard number 17 there is all about the strategic plan, and it goes on to talk about what we'd like to see in those plans when they're submitted to the state library. One of the most important things we need to see is that your plan addresses community needs, and that you've somehow determined what those community needs are based on gathering community data. So focus groups, Becky and I feel, is just a really, for us, it's just a really fun way of doing this. But it's not the only way, and we have some other options for you in just a bit. But really, anytime your strategic plan, the entire purpose really of strategic planning is that libraries can make their decisions informed by the needs that have been expressed in the community, and then by seeing how the library can have some involvement in helping to meet those community needs through library programming and services. So that's really kind of at the top of our list of what we look for when we're looking at these strategic plans. And you know, truth in advertising, knowing that focus groups, conducting those in person, might not be everyone's cup of tea. We fully acknowledge that. But as I said, Becky and I really enjoy facilitating these kinds of groups. Maybe it's because we were both theater majors at one point in our life. No, I lied about that. I never was, but I think Becky was. Weren't you?
I was indeed. And it really is one of my most favorite parts of my job is working with those community groups and hearing the results that come out of those.
Yeah. And Becky is very active in community theater in the Dubuque area. I tried out for, in high school, Becky might not know this, I tried out for our high school production of MASH, and I auditioned for the role of Hot Lips. I didn't get it. Instead, I got the role of nurse number 3. So I haven't tried out for a play since then. It damaged me somehow. Anyway, we really enjoy working with focus groups, and the information we have to share today is from our work in doing planning for results. But you know, there are other ways that you can gather community data about your town, and this is a wonderful resource in case you've not spent any time here. We would love to direct you to the State Data Center. Gary Kroeb with the State Library staff is the coordinator for the State Data Center. And there was so much information there that you can draw on about the demographics of your town. And especially good link is City Quick Facts. And it's just a great resource for you to bring forward and share with your board a lot of those demographics about your community. And you can certainly include this data into your strategic plan. The trick is you have to connect the data that you found in the State Data Center with how you think that information will inform your decisions about library programming and services. Now, there's also a possibility that your city government or maybe other community groups and organizations in your city are doing citywide planning. And if that's the case, I hope to shout that those other community groups, maybe other community groups and organizations less likely, but certainly if your city is originating some kind of citywide planning on behalf of the entire city and all of its services to its residents. I hope to shout that the city government will include the library in a citywide planning effort. And if that happens, that's another great way to be involved in kind of a bigger picture look at what your community members and residents would have to say about many city services in addition to the library. And next time in August, we'll talk more about surveys. That's another way to get input for certain. We will have more to say about the pros and cons of using surveys and our love affair or not with using surveys. It's kind of a love-hate relationship, I think Becky and I have at this point. But what we really love, I can tell you, the product we really love is Project Outcome. So more on that next time, but if you haven't yet looked at Project Outcome, spend some time looking at that too, because that's a great way to see how you can take the programming and services that you're offering and see how you can kind of assess the impact that programming and services have made at your library. All right, so those are other ways to collect data, but we will come right back to the top of the list there with more details about focus groups.
And that is me. You are going to hear me say this first one that shows up on the slide. Before you begin any kind of, whether it's a survey or focus group or whatever, you need to decide what you're trying to find out. Decide what you need to know. So Bon, if you hit the first one there you go. And I will mention this over and over and over again. There's no point in gathering a group of people together until you know what you want to get out of it at the end. That's the first thing you need to do. You don't know who to invite until you know what it is that you want to know. And then what are you going to do with that information afterwards? How are you going to use those results? You know, figure out what you want to know, invite your people, and then what are you going to do with that? That will also help figure out who you're going to invite and what questions you're going to ask. There's a couple of other sort of short ones. Use a note taker is one. I put this list together from a variety of places, and they do talk about using a note taker. I have to confess, though, when I do facilitation of focus groups, I tend not to use a note taker. I really like to do it myself, because as the facilitator, I feel like I can help group and sort of guide the conversation and make sure that the information that gets written down is what I feel like the group is doing. For people who are maybe less experienced at facilitating, a note taker can be really, really helpful, because then you get everything down and you can work on grouping that information later. And then Bonnie is going to talk about the last one. But before we launch into that, let's see, what else was I going to? One of the reasons, and I usually start with this comment, one of the reasons I like focus groups so well is we librarians are really good at data. We know how to count. We know how many story hours we've done. We know how many people used our computers. That information that we're good at doesn't give us what we need as we're looking to expand services, as we're looking to figure out what those community needs are for our strategic plans. So again, we know how to count those things. What we're looking for instead of that quantitative information is qualitative information. And that's what you're going to get out of focus groups. So for me, that's why this is such an important concept for people to do. And now Bon's got a quick little note about another reason you can use focus groups.
Well, yes, I think another really cool thing to do when you have people gathered together at the library or whatever venue this takes place, I think why not use that as awareness, as an opportunity to raise awareness about what libraries are doing that maybe many people in the room just might not realize. I think libraries are very good, as Becky said, we're so good at gathering data and facts and numbers and statistics, but to share those, we often do on social media. We'll often do it on our websites. You're certainly supplying those to the state library in the annual survey, right? But to take some of those of most interesting statistics to share and flip it into an interesting way to tell them to an in-person group, I think it's just a good opportunity for that. There are so many things that libraries are doing in Iowa and across the country that maybe people are largely unaware of. I think it's a nice spin-off benefit. Would people in your focus group be interested to know? I think they would, about how many books are being downloaded through your Bridges ebook service that the library is providing. Do they know that there are more public libraries in the US than there are Starbucks? Do they know that there are more public libraries in the US than there are McDonald's? Some years ago, this was an interesting did you know fact about libraries, that more Americans attended library programs than Major League Baseball and Major League Basketball games combined. That kind of stuff, I think, is just fun to share with a live audience. You could even include maybe an infographic of your own design to give them some of these statistics in a more, just in a more entertaining way, kind of in a conversational way before the real questioning, like you really want to know, as Becky said in her first point, what you really want to know, just kind of toss this into the beginning. If you're looking for some of these did you know statistics about public libraries, the Every Library Project has a lot of them, and the ALA website also has a lot of them. So that was my little extra favorite tip about focus groups.
All right, so this is going to be on a handout that you'll have access to after the session is over. When we go ahead and upload the video, you'll have access to this. This I gathered, it's been tweaked from the PLA model, Strategic Planning for Results. These are some of the groups that you want to think about having represented when you're putting together focus groups. In a little bit, I'm going to talk about some of the other ways to use focus groups. And so you might not need all of these people, but if you're doing just very basic community information, what are our community needs? If that's the reason you're doing these focus groups, is to identify those needs, perhaps for a strategic plan, this is a nice list, I think, of people to make sure you want to think about inviting. We typically call these stakeholders. So it doesn't have to be, if you look at the one that talks about educational groups, it doesn't have to be the superintendent of the school district. It might be the kindergarten teacher, because they may have a very different stakeholder perspective from educational organizations. So when I work with either a library director or a library board to think about who do we want to invite, I go back to that very first question. What is it that you want to know? And that will help you identify who you need to invite then. The other side of the screen where we talk about some of the other considerations, these are fairly obvious ones. They're mostly demographic. Make sure you get all the age groups represented, men and women, newcomers to the community versus people who've been there a long time. Again, these are for if you're trying to get a real good feel of your community as a whole. Also think about things like, are all of the geographic areas, did you get somebody from the wrong side of the tracks on this committee to talk to you about what your committee needs? So that's just something, again, you can take a look at that, add to it. There may be groups in your community that are specific to your community that you're going to want to talk to. So feel free to add to those. But I think this is a really good list. So once we've kind of identified those groups, you're going to go ahead, Bon, you can go to the next slide, and you or your board are going to invite those people. So you're going to have to get some information about them. If you do it via email, hopefully you can get email things. A lot of times we start this process with an in-person or a phone call. And we say, would you be interested in doing this? Then you gather that contact information and send an invitation. And Bonnie mentioned earlier, we have a couple of samples of invitations. And again, these invitations are written for gathering community-wide information. We're going to talk in a little bit about other ways that you might do it, and then they will be very specialized invitations as well. So like I said, a lot of times you'll start with sort of a verbal invitation, or if it's not an invitation, just something that says, would you be interested in helping us with this? The other thing, this is just sort of a little side note here, I have found, I've done this strategic planning process with a number, about 50 libraries right now, and what we have found is you tend to get the best, if these are longer sessions, you tend to get the best interest when you think very hard about the timing. Is Wednesday night church night? Then you don't want to try and gather people on a Wednesday night. Is 5 till 7 when people are still coming home because you have a lot of commuters in your community? Think about people with kids who need to feed their kids. Maybe you need to do a meal, but you also need to have something, a babysitter for those kids. So as you're thinking about inviting them, this is going to be very specific to your community. Is a full meal going to do it? Do they just need snacks because it's later at night? Do people want to be tucked in by 8 o'clock and you need to be finished by then? So think through all of those timing issues before you issue those invitations. So the next slide, we're going to talk about some of the components. We talked a little bit about recruitment, and I really like those two words, very purposeful. And again, it goes back to what it is that you're trying to find out with this group. So, make sure you have that purpose. And then representative. You want it to be representative of everybody in the community that you need to get information from. Another thing that you want to think about is that moderator. And the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that moderator role and some ways that I do it, as well as ways to get some training on that. There's some really, really good sites out there. The other thing, I think I pulled these three pieces, the recruitment, the moderator, and the discussion guide, from an article that I read. And really your discussion guide is your agenda. It's just to let people know. You can send it out ahead of time so they kind of know the timing, but you don't have to. But make sure they have that in front of them so they understand what's going to happen tonight. They like to feel comfortable. They like to know what their role is going to be. So really you want it to be short and simple. You don't have to have all of the information on there, but something written either on the wall or that they can have in front of them is always really nice. It will also hopefully list some of those questions that you're going to ask. And sometimes you'll want to actually put a time limit on there. We're going to do introductions from 7 until 7:15. Then we're going to do our first 3 questions from 7:15 until 8:15. And then at 8:15, we're going to have a wrap up and you'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about what happened, and then we're going to talk about next steps. All right, so those are kind of the things that you're going to want to think about, and certainly you'll want to schedule, from 7:15 to 8:45 or whatever it is. But you also, as a facilitator, need to be able to be very flexible with that. You don't know what direction that group is going to take that will give you some really great information. And so sometimes you need to stretch things out a little bit, and sometimes they've got nothing to say. So, stop that one and move on to something else. All right, so here is some resources on this next slide that can, I think, be really, really helpful as we're looking at how do we do this. The American Library Association had a whole couple of years where they focused on libraries transforming communities. And one of the things that they found is, when we want our libraries to be in the center of that community and we want to be part of that transformation process, we ask librarians to step into roles that they're very uncomfortable with. And I've got to tell you, as a librarian, I had the same reaction. And as I started as a consultant, I can remember talking to librarians and saying, there's this really great process out there where you get to listen to your community and you get to get information from them. And librarians just rolled their eyes at me and said, yeah, I don't know how to do that. I'm not a facilitator. I'm a librarian. Don't ask me to go in there and be getting this information from people. And I wasn't able to do that either. It was a really scary thought, gathering all those community people and trying to sort of manage or facilitate that process. So the American Library Association, through this Libraries Transforming Communities project, found out that there's a whole lot of librarians out there with that same feeling and that same attitude. I can't do this. This is outside of my comfort zone. So they worked for a really long time to put together this facilitation skills course. There's a really great guide, a written guide that goes along with it. But I really encourage you to take a look at this course. It's free, and it's for anybody that wants to take it. Maybe it's not you as the director who are going to facilitate these groups. Maybe it's one of your staff members. Maybe it's going to be a board member. Maybe you can hire someone from the outside to help you with this. Maybe there's somebody in your community who has these skills. I think this e-course is really, really great and has some really good information in it on how to do it. It includes things like what are the best practices when somebody is really angry, and that was one of my fears when I was standing up. What do you do with that person who stands up and starts shouting about how the library doesn't have what he wants in the building? I didn't know how to handle that, and it helps talk about what are some skill sets that you can have to help diffuse that situation. Or what are some of the best practices? What are some of those conversation starters? There's lots of other information out there besides this for learning facilitation skills, but I think this one is really focused on libraries and working with your community. So I really, really like that. It's really detailed. And I will tell you, I worked with a community, and the librarian sort of pulled me aside before we were headed into this session where we were going to be doing some brainstorming about things. And she said, we invited the mayor to this, and he's anti-library. And part of the reason he's coming is so that he can get you off track and, sort of get people, moved over to his side of things. And she said, so I just want you to be prepared. I kind of had to take a second, take stock and go, uh-oh. But as a facilitator, if you do your job right, then that person shouldn't be able to get you off track. And that's what this is really good at, is helping you feel comfortable in managing those conversations and making sure that one person doesn't take over, and that you hear from everybody, and that people who maybe have different personality styles are all heard from, or people who aren't used to being asked for their opinion about things. Again, those people from the wrong side of the tracks, nobody's maybe asked them before, and they're going to be a little reluctant to share their opinions. So as the facilitator, you're going to want to be able to, talk them through and help them with that. And the more comfortable you get with that, the easier it's going to be. To sort of finish this one up, this was actually put together again for community-wide conversations, but it was also, I think Bonnie has in the notes here, that it's got some really good topics and things that you can use for a lot of ways. It can help you as you're trying to manage a board meeting or as you're trying to manage a book discussion group. So even though it was really made for something a little bit more generic than these focus groups, I think it's got some really good advice in there. And Bonnie is going to talk next about one of the very specific tools that we use when we do strategic planning for results. And again, I use these facilitation skills when I do this next piece.
Well, yes, as Becky and I do planning for results, and I know the rest of our colleagues in the other district offices do likewise. They facilitate planning for results projects as well. Becky and I have discussed the many different ways that you could use a discussion tool. There's a lot of different models out there, and we've tried a lot of different models. You know, the old Paul Simon song, Still Crazy After All These Years? Well, turns out we're still crazy about the SWOT exercise after all these years. There's a lot of different methods and a lot of different variations on a theme. We've tried using a purely aspirational kind of a conversation where we ask people just all of the wonderfulness of the town where they live, and it is very positive in nature for sure. And there's another similar one to a purely aspirational discussion starter. The other acronym is called SOAR, SOAR, and that has a lot of these aspirational ideas in it. So while there are a lot of variations on this discussion starter, we still keep coming back to SWOT. It's been around a long time, but it is so grounded, we believe, in what brings back really candid comments. That's why I like it so much. We don't just only ask about all the positive happiness in town. You can see that the W stands for weaknesses, the T stands for threats. We also ask these questions about their community. And even though they might seem like a negative way to discuss something, it really does bring out more candid comments, because I think the questions themselves and the discussion becomes more searching. It becomes more honest, really, because this technique of a SWOT really is getting at not just a community's strengths and the opportunities that are out there, but what are the weaknesses? What are the pitfalls? What are the struggles that the town has been seeing? And what are the external threats out there that have some impact on the life being lived in these communities? So we apply the SWOT exercise to the community in general. At our very first gathering of these focus groups, we're talking about the community in general. We don't start talking about library specifics until farther down the road. So think about applying this to the community in general. And once the focus group people admit to these things and they really have an opportunity to talk really quite honestly about the common problems, but certainly the common benefits and really great things about living in their communities, but also the common problems, I think they're better able then to brainstorm common solutions. It really has led us to, I think, better problem solving. So that's why we like this better than other methods. Yeah.
Just a real quick interruption here. When I talk to groups a lot of times, I also talk about what this does for me is it helps identify those community needs. And you mentioned that a little bit, that's the way until the library knows the needs, they can't help the community. We can sit in our library and say, well, we think this is what's going on in town, and this is probably what people want and what people would like us to do. But until you know what those needs are you are not going to be central to that community. So for me, that's the other piece of this that I really like, is the whole reason a board is doing a plan, or we're trying to identify those needs, is so we can help solve the problems that are in our community. What can the library do to help solve those problems? So to me, it really ends up with, what are the needs that we can help fix? And that, to put the library at the heart of your community.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with that. And in fact, we have a slide coming up where we want you all to look at the results of one of these SWOT conversations. But I agree with you, Becky. It does lead to, I think, more effective problem solving, because when you think about the S in strength and the A in aspirations, when you talk about those things, what that leads focus groups to want to do is more of the same. Let's make sure, and city governments too, really, let's make sure that we don't lose sight of all of these things that are great about our town. Let's not lose sight of those, and let's make sure we continue to do those things. Absolutely valid. And yes, absolutely, you don't want to stop doing all the great things that lead to the quality of life in your towns. But strengths and aspirations aren't going to give you much to go on in terms of problem solving. So I'm glad you underscored that, because I totally agree with that. I wanted to throw in these photos just because I think it shows a focus group in action. This is a couple of years ago when Lamar's Public Library did planning for results. So how about using your chat feature right now before we move on to the other question we want to ask of you? You can use your chat space to just kind of comment on, what do you see in these two photos? Is there something that strikes you about these photos? I'll bring up my chat space and see if you see what I see.
And while you guys are answering that, Holly, I saw both of your questions come through here, and I think we'll do both of those maybe at the end, because I think they're really good questions, and I want to address those. The kind of open call. I've got some thoughts about that, and then the other one. So we'll get to those.
Yep.
I have
I saw
been
that
collecting
too.
a list of questions, Becky. This is Sam. So I will make sure I get Holly's questions stashed in my list.
Great, thank you.
Good. I saw that come through too. And yes, you guys are all seeing what I hoped you would see in these photos. I think this one on the left that shows, look at that variation in age groups there. That delighted me the most. And it always does whenever I'm doing planning for results in person, when I know that the library's focus group has gathered together all of these disparate age groups. So I like that a lot. And then the interaction, the activities that they're doing, it all shows that this group is pretty well engaged, I would say. So this is what this is a real life example of having gathered community opinion drawn from having done a real life SWOT conversation at Cherokee Public Library. So what you're going to see is a list of the community needs. Once you've gone through this conversation about the community's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, or if you're using a variation on the theme, you've now gathered a lot of public opinion from your focus group. So now you start to kind of condense it and summarize it and put it into a format where you can begin to see that there is, in the opinion that came back to you, there is some logical library involvement. There can be some logical library participation in the community needs that have been expressed. So what we'd like to do is pause right here and give you a chance to look at this list. Again, the real data that came from a real SWOT exercise at Cherokee Public Library. Take a look at this listing of community needs. And then once you've had a chance to read through them, tell us in chat, if you would, what you see as likely involvement. How could the library step in to some of these needs that have been expressed and maybe help further a response or a solution, or maybe the library could be a civic partner in furthering some of these solutions.
For sure, Nancy. That's a really easy, obvious one, isn't it? If workforce skills are an issue, we have that stuff. That's something libraries can do really easily.
Yeah. I want to bring up the chat and see.
Ooh, I like that.
What Lisa said, co-working space partnering. Oh, yeah.
Again, we have meeting rooms. They're already there. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, it should be going to. Sam, I'm confused now. They can see chat?
Your chat needs to go to everyone instead of to hosts and panelists. So maybe that's why.
Yeah. If you're weighing in on Bonnie's question here, if you change that drop down to all panelists and attendees when you type your comments in, then everyone will be able to see them. But we will also make sure that a transcript of this chat gets saved. And maybe in the meantime, Becky and Bonnie can read out some of the options, some of the responses longhand if they're not coming through.
Well, and a lot of you have said that you see likely library involvement in a lot of these needs that have been expressed. I think Meredith says the opportunities to provide a variety of programming for all ages. Look at that last one on the right side, develop reading promotion for families. Addressing workforce skills. I think Nancy referenced that one. Building tech skills and tech competencies. That to me has a public library written all over it. Develop more recreational activities for high schoolers. Develop more programming for adults. So yeah, I think you can see that it takes the conversation, it takes the initial gathering of the focus group and talking about the community in general, and then eventually we can begin to see how the library can be involved in helping, either by taking the lead or by being a great civic partner in helping to meet some of these community needs that have been expressed. Yeah, and Michelle says adult programming, reading promotions. Yes, you're right, Michelle. They all scream library, she says.
I'm going to jump in here too. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit, Bonnie, but talk about something. We have a resource coming up from Web Junction, and they have this really great story in there, and I want to bring it back to this. And that is, there are some things that the community group comes up with that you think, oh, there's no way the library can partner with that. One of the things that comes up a lot when I work with communities is transportation. You know, we've got horrible transportation town. We don't have taxis. We don't have a bus. We're a small town. You know, people can't get to stuff. That becomes a community-wide issue. And a board or whoever the group is looks at that and goes, well, there's no way the library can help with that. We're not going to put together a bus system. But what I really encourage groups to do then is start that brainstorming. And again, there's some really great places out here where you can get information. So if the issue is transportation, focus that on your library. If the issue is transportation to get to the library, what might you be able to do to take the library out to where those people are? If they can't come to you because transportation is an issue. So I really encourage people to think a little bit bigger and broader. And Web Junction has this really great story in the one article about a group that was brainstorming, and they said, community needs a swimming pool. Well, again, what can the library do to help get the pool, built? And certainly there are things we can, let them use our community room when they need to meet, or we can provide information about it. And there's those kinds of things that are obvious, logical ones. What the group in this resource did is they talked about what are the things that people want a swimming pool for. They want to focus on being outside. They want a place to cool off in the summertime. So think about sort of the essence of what a pool means and then translate that into the library. And so they talked about playing water-themed games during your summer reading program, making sure that everybody understands that the library is air conditioned during the summertime. And if you need a place to cool off, we don't have a pool, but you can come to the library and cool off. Having a slip and slide at your summer reading program. So think about, I just love the idea of sort of boiling down the essence of some of those needs that come up and figuring out what the library can do with those. I think there's some really great examples out there for that. So that's my sort of, make sure you look at some of those resources that are out there.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you mentioned that, Becky, because that is such a good article that you found on Web Junction. I hadn't seen that before, but it does show up in a resource slide coming up at the end. So do go take a look at that. It's really creative, a really creative way for a library to be involved in a very different community project. I liked it a lot. All right. So here comes the acting part.
Oh, this is me, sorry. So we've gotten those community needs. We've talked about what are some ways that the library can help with this. And again, this is going back to if you're putting together a plan. There's lots of other reasons to use focus groups, but if you're looking at writing a strategic plan, you're going to want to talk about some of those service priorities. There's a variety of ways. Bonnie and I like the strategic planning for results. They had what they called 18 library service responses. They're kind of old and tired right now. So this is Bonnie's list that she sort of adapted from those service responses. I've got another list that I've kind of adapted. I've been using the American Library Association's core values, and we've sort of adopted the service priorities based on that. But that's where this acting part comes in. All right, now that we know the need, we know how the library might do it, how are we going to put those into service priorities and actually put that into our plan? I think that's that's where we start talking about the goals and objectives. Again, when we're doing the plan, there are lots of other ways, though, besides just using it in your plan. Again, you maybe did a community group, you did a focus group, and you found out that people are having a really hard time getting to the library because they all work out of town. And again, you can find that through census, you can find it through focus groups. So think about that as a board. It may go in your plan, but what else can you do with that information? Do we need to look at our hours? How are we going to use this input to change what we do or tweak what we do? It doesn't mean you throw everything out and start over, but what is it that we're going to want to change based on this information? And again, it goes right back to why did you have the focus group and what are you going to do with that information? If you've already decided you can't change your hours for whatever reason, then there's no point in using that information that you've gathered. So you might want to think about, again, what information it is that you're looking for. All right, now I've got, there we go. I love this slide. I found this one a little while ago. time for new results.
I love this slide, but I really like the story connected to it even more.
Yes, and this again is another way of using focus groups. So I was working with a library, and they actually started this process thinking about strategic planning, but as it came out, we really had a very different idea in mind of what we wanted to do for a focus group, as opposed to just using it for strategic planning. So this library had a full-time staff member whose job it was to be a primary resource for schools and daycares. That's all this person did, was work with schools and daycares. The time came when the library couldn't afford to have somebody dedicated to that anymore, and they were going to have to pull this person, and everybody loved her. She was very good at it. She worked intensively with schools and daycares, giving them exactly what they needed and wanted. And the library said, we can't do that anymore. There was a huge uproar. The schools were angry, the daycares were angry, other staff members were angry. The community as a whole said, how dare you pull this valuable resource? The library didn't have a choice. They had to do other things, and they had to reassign that person's time. So they had this big uproar. It really didn't go over very well at all. A new director came in at that point, and he had this great idea of, what if we use a focus group of some of these stakeholders, the daycares, the teachers, the people that we're supporting, their administrators, and what if we try to do a couple of things with these focus groups? We want to inform them about our loss in resources. We need people to understand why we have to make this decision to pull this person. We also want to gather input. All right, if we have to pull this from you and these things that you really depend on, what else might we be able to provide that would help you? What is it that you were getting from this person that we may be able to do a little bit differently and still give you something that's of value? It also, as they were making some of the decisions, gave this stakeholder group some buy-in to the results that came out of it. So the library director and I sat down, and he did a very good job of figuring out who to invite. And then we sat down to figure out, again, we knew what our goals were going to be. We wanted to inform them about the reasons why we had to do it. We wanted to gather their input, and we wanted to get buy-in. And so we came up with a list of questions, and not just a question and an answer, but a discussion. And I facilitated a couple of groups of these, and we came up with some really great ideas that they were then able to implement. I'm not going to say this solved all the problems. There were still people who were angry about this, but there were some really great discussions. People understood it a little bit better. And while there were, a few people who were still disgruntled, many of them were much, much happier with the way this turned out. So again, yes, we can use it for strategic planning, but there's a lot of other reasons to use focus groups. And again, it depends on who you invite, and it depends on what you're going to do with those outcomes. So that's my quick story from Oskaloosa.
That's a good story. So here's where we've been. This is our recap for this first installment of Acting on Input. There are the two uses for community groups that we've referenced this morning, doing it for a broad community-based purpose like strategic planning, where you're asking your focus group people to talk about the community in general, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities. That's the broad purpose. And then the specific purpose that Becky mentioned, I think, is just a great way to look at it, and a great way to bring in public opinion into a more specific project too. We've talked about finding and inviting participants, and we will have some handouts available to you inside Iowa Learns. As soon as I send those to Samantha, she will upload those for you to take a look at as handouts, some focus group meeting tips, and deciding on how the library can be involved and in what way, how deeply involved. in helping to meet the community needs that have been expressed. So we found again that the SWOT exercise brings back the most actionable information, because we have found that those questions are just more searching and the discussions are more candid. So we hope that if you use focus groups, you can make some very thoughtful and positive changes and reflect those changes into your library strategic plan. Here is our resource list for today. And I think it's the one at the bottom, the very last one referenced there, from Web Junction, Turning Community Input into Workable Ideas. That is one of the best articles I've read in a long time. So thanks to Becky for finding that one for us.
I'm actually going to throw one other one in here that I actually found this morning as I was putting things together, and I'm really disappointed I didn't find it earlier because I think it's a really helpful one. So I will make sure that Sam has that and we can add it either to the slide or to the list of resources or however that's going to be. But if you want to go further into the idea of the different types of focus groups that you can use, there is, again, another Web Junction resource. They did a project called Small Libraries Create Smart Spaces, and they gathered lots and lots of resources for that. And I found a really great one called Beyond the Survey, a basket of discovery tools, and it talks about a variety of ways to do focus groups. They talk about things that we've already talked about, stakeholder meetings or group interviews. They talk about topical focus groups, which is kind of what I described in the end. But then they talked about intercept surveys, where you ask people that are walking into the library, or you go to the mall and have a one-on-one conversation with people. They talk about happy hour brainstorming, and where do you go to do just some of those brainstorming things. And then they also have some advice on using visual tools. And I have seen this used with focus groups, particularly with architects, where they gather a group of people and they do a very visual thing. If we had the children's room next to this, how would that work? And then they get the information, or they get the advice from people. And they talk about wish trees, they talk about dot boards, they talk about pop-up spaces. So there's some really great ones in this Web Junction tool as well that I'm going to do. And again, if you want to get more into the types of focus groups aside from the two that we really talked about today. All right,
Awesome.
sorry.
No, that's good.
That's
We've
good.
got about 5 minutes left, and we do have a handful of questions that trickled in throughout. One, you mentioned that you had seen Becky, but we can do this one first. Would you do focus groups only leading into a strategic plan, or have them yearly and make adjustments? How often? Kind of what are your recommendations on that question?
I thought that was a really good one, and also related to the question that came right afterwards about an over-surveyed community. I think it's very similar to that. So again, I think consider what it is that you want to know. We don't want to ask those same people, to do a focus group. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of librarian time, but it also takes a lot of community time. And what happens is we tend to get the same people over and over. They're the ones who say yes because they're interested in the community. And so you're right, you don't want to keep asking those. So one idea that I had as I was thinking about that is, because I do like the idea of, thinking about your strategic plan every year. We want you to be thinking about, did that work? Did it not work? Do we need to tweak this goal? And so using those focus groups, I think was sort of an interesting idea. I've not thought of that before. But what if you did a different group of people each year? So, we have the big community group, but then we focus the next year on inviting 5 or 6 people to talk about the service priority that had to do with creating partnerships. And so we talk to some of those people that we've tried to partner with, or people that we weren't able to partner with. And we do a small focus group the next year with that group. And then maybe the next year it's educators. And maybe the next year it's the financial community or whatever it is. So doing something smaller and more focused in each of those years. I think it's a really great idea. I love that.
Have you seen communities partner, like if the town community center has recently done some focus groups, have you seen libraries partner with that group to grab their survey, to grab their focus group notes and kind of feed things, or is that?
Absolutely. I'm an unqualified yes.
Me
That's
too.
usually the conversation that I have with the director when they start talking about it is find out first if somebody's already done this work, and you don't
Yes.
have to.
Yeah,
Yes.
you might
But
not be able to get quite as specific on that. What question do you need
right.
to know? But it's still extremely valuable information and can reduce some of that fatigue in your community as well.
But you know what else I've found in doing planning for results in Northwest, I found that sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes it's the library that takes the lead on this strategic planning project, and it's the city council who gets wind of it. In fact, I think mayors and councils and supervisors, those people ought to be invited to this project. And when other groups like a city government gets wind of this, they will often have interest in using the results from the library's project. So I think that's also a very nice spin-off benefit of this.
There was a question specifically around recruitment. Would you specifically invite people from, kind of your target audiences, or do an open call to somebody who would self-identify as, maybe from a minority population you're trying to reach? Or how would you, a little of each, I suspect might be the answer. How would you, you hate to make assumptions too, right? Hey, you're a stay-at-home mom. Or, no, I'm not.
There is that. I work really hard when I work. Usually it's with boards who are identifying those stakeholders. And if you have a board that is representative of your community and embedded in your community, they do tend to know those things. They do know who's a stay-at-home. I don't, but they do. I am not a big believer in sort of the open call. I've seen it fail spectacularly. When people have tried to do it that way. I facilitate whatever you want me to facilitate. And I've had a couple of boards who said, yep, that's what I want to do. We just want to throw it out on social media. Every time, I mean to a time, when people have thrown it out, it has failed miserably. But I do like, Sam, your idea of maybe once you've identified some of those stakeholders, then maybe putting it out and saying we're having this. But you tend to get people with an axe to grind. I've watched that happen. You tend to get people who come in with preconceived ideas of how they want the process to go, and that can also help fail. And you also have people who aren't committed. You haven't invited them specifically, so they blow it off that night. I literally had one where they threw it open. People kind of said, yeah, we think we'll be there, and literally nobody showed up that night. So for me, it's not been a very effective way of doing it. It may work for other people, but it's not for me.
No, that's been my experience generally too, is that you need some targeted recruitment. So you have at least a few, and you could throw it out, maybe consider having an application type process. Why do you want to be part of this committee? And if their response is, well, I just want to complain about how the library lost that staff member, then you can say like, well, let's schedule this time to talk separately or something. But you could maybe cut out the axe grinding that way. I do want to acknowledge we had a question come through about doing focus groups with teens right at the very beginning. I don't think we probably have time to get into all of that now, unless you want to offer a quick comment on how you feel a focus group with teens is similar or different. Becky's.
I don't have experience with doing focus groups for teens. The groups I've done have included teenagers, but not exclusively.
That's my experience as well. And I think that works really well as long as you can, encourage them to speak up, because they tend to be a little bit quieter when they're in a mixed group. I did just ask a library that I was working with to have the teen librarian facilitate that focus group. And so I can work with that person on what are some of the questions that and help them sort of do that. But as a facilitator, that's not my skill set. But a youth librarian, hopefully they're going to have those skills.
Yeah.
So that would be my recommendation.
I love the idea of having someone the teens already know there. If you just walk in, I'm from the state library, they don't want to get their library in trouble. They don't, maybe they do, I don't know, but having a familiar face, I think will go a long way with teens. And then one last really quick question. What do you do when someone in your focus group says like, oh man, if only the library offered story hours on Tuesday mornings, and you're like, oh, we've been doing story hour on Tuesday mornings for 16 years. How do you handle that?
I have a really good answer for that one. And
I'd make a joke. No, I'd just make a joke out of it.
I don't. I talk to the library board afterwards and say, you do have a problem here because you've been doing it and they don't know about it. Promotion is your issue that you need to deal with. That's your need. And so I flip it back. And yes, you certainly address it at the time, let the librarian say, we do have story hours. But that happens all the time. I'll bet there's not a single focus group that I do where the librarian doesn't say to me, but we do that. Then I think, why don't they know about it if you do it? And so we translate that into the need.
Well, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about that in our third session for this series on acting on results, right? So now that you know that people don't know about your program or service, what do you need to do to get that word out there a little more? Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, a huge thank you to Becky and Bonnie for putting this on with and for us today. I know I learned a lot about focus groups, and I'm excited to see how this plays out in your library. After we wrap up here, we'll grab the attendee list from Zoom and let Iowa Learns know who was there. So look for our email inviting you to complete the evaluation. When that email comes out, we'll also be sure to send you the slide deck and resource list as well. So again, thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks to Becky and Bonnie, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye, everyone.